Hello, everyone. Welcome to the GEMS podcast. I am so glad you all are here.
Today, we are so lucky to be joined by Dr. Ritu Raman, who is a postdoctoral fellow at MIT and a biomedical engineer. Thank you so much for joining us. Do you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be here. Honestly, like the best Zoom meetings that I get to be on these days are ones where I get to interact with people that I wouldn't normally meet. So I feel like that's kind of a plus of having these kinds of virtual engagements. So even though you're in Georgia and I'm in Massachusetts, we're connected, and that's great. So yeah, as you mentioned, I'm a biomedical engineer, but I was actually initially trained as a mechanical engineer. I went into college thinking that I wanted to make rockets and become an astronaut and go to space, because that sounds cool. Everybody wants to do that, or most people do. But I was kind of silly. I couldn't enroll in the Intro to Aerospace Engineering class at Cornell in my first year. I just couldn't figure out how to do it. By the time I figured it out, it was all full. So I'm like, what do I do? And this girl that was living next to me in my dorm told me that there was a professor who taught Intro to Biomedical Engineering, and he was really funny and he had a great British accent. So I signed up for that class, and that is how I became a mechanical / biomedical engineer. So a lot of what I do is I, think about the materials that we build with and think about adding new materials to that. So, if you think about everything that's surrounding you right now, whether it's lights, your computer, the desk you're sitting at, they're all made out of synthetic materials like woods or metals or plastics. And obviously that's worked out really well for us, right? For the last thousands of years, we're doing fine. We can do really cool things with those, but they're still not as cool as our bodies are. If I want my computer to start processing computational stuff that's way harder, I want to run it crazy amounts of programs on it or play video games or something. I don't actually do that. But if I did, then I would have to go buy a new computer, right? I can't actually tell my computer somehow become better at what you're doing. Same thing, if I picked up the computer and dropped it on the floor and the screen cracked, buy $2,000, right? I just have to go buy a new one. There's nothing else I can do. But that's not true of our bodies. If I want to get faster or stronger, I can work out. I can do push-ups, I can go for a run, and my my bones, they're gonna adapt. And if I fall a reasonable distance, not 50 floors, but if I fall and I break my legs or, scrape my skin or get bruised, I am going to get better. My body is going to recover from that. And so to me, it's a very long-winded way of saying that to me, that mismatch is what drives my research. It's what drives my work. I'm why aren't we building with biological materials that can sense and respond and adapt to their environment in ways that traditional materials can't? So instead of making robots out of metal or motors, can we start making robots that are powered by skeletal muscles? So they can move and walk around, but they can also do things like exercise and get stronger or heal from damage. And my goal with all of this work is kind of twofold. Part of it is just to figure out, how do you build with biology? How do you make the tools? How do you understand the design rules and principles of putting living cells together and making something that actually creates some action or function? And the second part is thinking about using it in a way that's helpful to our community and to the world. And for me, because of that biomedical engineering interest, that's always been in medicine. I think about, we put lots of medicines and implantable devices inside of our bodies, and we make them out of synthetic materials, and we expect them to respond to our changing disease or our changing bodies and changing environment. And the human body is the most dynamic environment that you could put a machine into. So you should make that out of the most dynamic materials possible. So the second part of my research focuses on, how can we take biological materials and make machines or implantable devices that we put inside human beings that can adapt to their changing needs over their lifetime and help them feel better if they get sick.
And so you were saying how you started as a mechanical engineer and kind of transitioned into biomedical engineering. So what, I guess the differences or skills that you learned in mechanical engineering that differs from biomedical engineering, how do you see those presented in your work? Like, do you use them on a daily
Yeah, for
basis?
sure. So I think it's one of those very funny things where the more you like dive deeper and deeper into engineering education and research, you realize that there's a ton of overlap between the fields. So while at an undergraduate level, some of the core classes that you take in one field versus another might be very different. Once you get to my level of thinking, like, what department do I establish a lab in so I can start doing my own independent research? I could literally pretty much go anywhere, because everyone will be like, well, we're really interested in, material scientists might be like, we're really interested in the materials that you're using to build with. And mechanical engineers are like, well, we're really interested in these robots that you're making. And biomedical engineers are like, well, we're actually more interested in what you can tell us about skeletal muscle disease and damage. And chemical engineers are like, you use a lot of biochemicals as batteries for your robots. So like, how does that work? So different aspects of it feed into different fields. And certainly it helps to have a fundamental skill set, especially during your undergraduate training, because it gives you like a sense of theory that you're applying to the work, or a lens that you're applying to the work. So as a mechanical engineer, a lot of what I learned was, the most basic class that you take in mechanical engineering is like, if I take something, this is my chapstick, but we can pretend this is, I don't know. Actually, we can just pretend it's chapstick. So if I take this tube of chapstick and I apply this amount of force on it, like, what is it going to look like? How do we know, like, when it bends like this, what happens to it when it suddenly cracks and buckles like this? If I threw it, how far would it go? Basically, how do the forces that every material experiences change or shape the way that it reacts to its environment? And so when I apply that to medicine, but I specifically look at the medical context of muscle and like how we're generating force and producing motion in our own life, right? So I'm thinking about, like, what forces are the cells exerting on each other, and like, how do they know when they're damaged? Like, there's some sort of mechanical change in their environment that's telling them that they're damaged and they need to do something to heal. And similarly, like, how is muscle generating force that's actually being transmitted? If it were just contracting in the air, nothing would happen, but it has to attach to bones via tendons and like pull on the bones and help us do kind of very complex motions. So I definitely look at biomedical engineering from that mechanical perspective. But there are other people who would look at it very differently. If somebody were coming at it from a stem cell biology background, they would be like, that's all well and good, but I'm really interested in how the cells look very different when you're young versus you're old, and how some people can respond to damage better than others. So both of those are equally valid and equally important. But because of our unique backgrounds and training, we would be contributing to that problem in a different way.
And before you got into biomedical engineering with your British professor, was there an experience beforehand that drew you into engineering as a whole, or science and math? Did you always know that that's what you wanted to pursue?
I did not at all. It was an option always for me, but it was not the only option. So I grew up in like a family of engineers. My mom's a chemical engineer, my dad's a mechanical engineer, my grandpa is a civil engineer. And those are like the three people that I spent the most amount of time with growing up. And I moved around a lot when I was growing up. So I was born in India, lived in Kenya for a while, moved back to India, and then lived pretty much all over the US. Like, I would bounce around from state to state like every couple of years. So that experience, I think, shaped me in a really big way, in that the two things that are most important when you're moving around a ton and you're like always the new kid in school is like, number one, it helps when something stays consistent at school, right? So like, the language you're learning is going to change, the history you're learning is going to change, the geography you're learning is going to change. But like, math and science, for the most part, all around the world, pretty much the same. So like, that helps. So you just feel like, all right, cool. Like, this is an entirely new map, but like, algebra didn't change, and that's great. So that feels pretty good. I think it helps you kind of feel like stuff is changing around me, but I'm still, progressing towards the same thing. And the second thing that helps is stuff not changing too much at home. Like the most consistent thing in my life was my family, and we get along super well. So like obviously I look to them as role models, and I tell the story of like literally one of my very first memories is when I was growing up in Kenya. We would live in a city called Nairobi during the week, but on the weekends we would travel to pretty remote villages where my dad and some of his colleagues were putting up communication towers to connect the villages to the rest of the world. So like that was a very, very obvious example to me at a very young age that like here is somebody who is able to have a lasting impact on this community that is positive because of their science and engineering training. So I thought, that's great. Like that's, you know, at the end of the day, I just want to do something that's meaningful and impactful to other people. And science was a path to doing that. But like, did I consider other paths? Absolutely. Like I wanted to be a writer, which is a dream that I'm still working on right now. I wanted to be a fashion designer. I wanted to be the captain of the Indian national cricket team. At one point I wanted to be a priest. I don't know. There were like a lot of different things, but I think there was like a NASA space launch event, like the day that I was like putting together a lot of my Common App applications and things. And I was just like, okay, it seems reasonable, aerospace engineering, but like maybe if something else had happened, I would have applied to something else.
Well, you'll have to let us know as you progress with your writing hobby. If you publish something, then we'll have to read it.
Perfect timing, actually, because tomorrow, I will let you in on this secret. I was going to post it on Instagram tomorrow, but I will tell you today. I was going to post that I wrote a book, actually, for MIT Press called Biofabrication. And it is targeted at a general audience. The way they tell you to talk to a general audience is high school and above. So it's like your group. So yeah, it's a book about building with biological materials like living cells. And it's about all of the things that you can do with it. You know, some of the robot stuff that I mentioned, but also medical devices and implants, like 3D printed meat that you grow in the lab. A lot of fun stuff. So unfortunately I finished it and it's accepted, but the amount of time it will take for them to like take my Word document and convert it into something that looks like a book and has cover art and print a bunch of it is a year. So it will be out in fall 2021.
That is so exciting. Congratulations.
Thank you. My parents are like so excited. You have no idea, because I've always been like, I want to be a writer. I want to be a writer. And I think they were worried that I let go of that dream when I became a scientist. So it's honestly been one of the biggest surprises for me, like how much science it opens up your world more. It doesn't shut you out to other things. You can still be a writer or a photographer or a dancer or whatever else it is that you are.
Absolutely. Wow, that's awesome. I will definitely read it once it is published and comes out. So what was your PhD research on? Does it have something to do with the things that you put in your book?
Yeah. So it's very funny because, you know, my PhD research was on these robots that I started talking about a little bit. But I'm laughing because I wrote about them in my book, and you know, sometimes when you do PhD research, like the whole point of it is you're doing something that nobody's ever done before, right? Like that's why it's a PhD. Like you're showing for the first time X. And so my PhD research was like one of the first demonstrations of robots that could move and walk around powered by engineered skeletal muscle. And so they really, you know, my editor really wanted me to like write about this in the book. And so I did. And then, you know, you always send these things out for peer review and people will come back. And there's this one guy who was just like so ornery about this. And he was just like, well, like the author talks about her own work a lot. Like she should talk about other people that have made robots like this. And I'm like, they don't exist. Like that's kind of the point, you know, like no matter how, I think the really cool thing about getting a PhD or just doing research in general is no matter how young you are, everything you do is like the first time that it's been done. So like you are automatically the expert. And talking about that is like not a bad thing because it's the first time. So my editor kind of brushed it off because he was like, that chapter exists because like you made it exist, and that field exists because you were one of the people that helped start it. And it's really cool when people recognize that about you and also don't dismiss it as just like, well, like you're too young, so like don't talk about yourself too much. So that was great. But yes, back to the actual research. I kind of, the way I show it, where is my hair tie? I usually have a hair tie all of the time that is perfect for this demonstration. Oh, there it is. Okay. All right. So I will show you how these robots work. But essentially, skeletal muscle, the way it works, as I mentioned, is it's stretched across an articulating joint like our elbow. And it's attached to bones via tendons. And every time a signal from your motor neurons, which extend out of your spinal cord, tell the muscle to contract. So you're like, I want to move this muscle, and this neuron fires and tells your muscle to contract. It does, and you can generate these like large locomotions every time it contracts, right? And obviously you have a ton of muscles and they're connected to everything, so I can do all kinds of crazy stuff, and it's kind of fun. So if you were trying to recreate that in a robot, the simplest way that I could think of to do it was to 3D print a flexible skeleton. So it's essentially just like a piece of plastic, kind of like a jelly-like plastic, a little bit like Jell-O, but a little bit stiffer, that kind of look like this. It's essentially like two legs that mimic the tendons, like the stiffer tendons, and then like a flexible beam that mimics the articulating joint, like the elbow. And then I would 3D print these molds into which I would mix a bunch of cells and proteins that were from skeletal muscle of a mouse. They would self-assemble to form like a really dense tissue that kind of looks like a muscle rubber band. It's just tiny. It's like a few millimeters wide, but essentially it's like a muscle rubber band. So I take the muscle rubber band and I pop it around the skeleton, and then you can tell this muscle to contract in a few different ways. You can like send an electrical pulse to it so it feels like the neuron is what's telling it to contract, or you can like genetically engineer them to be responsive to different things. So like one of the biggest things that I did was genetically engineer the cells to be responsive to blue light. So you just flash blue light on them, and if you flash it in like this direction, the robot, like every time it contracts, it does this. So like the more you contract on this side, it's like crawl, 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 crawl. If you flash it on this side, it crawls in that direction. If you flash on the side, it can like rotate. So essentially it's just like a robot that follows the light, which was like really cool and like made for a lot of fun videos, but also was very exciting because it showed people that you could make a robot that is like responsive to its environment, that is powered by biological materials. And it's actually powered by, it's controlled by light, but it's powered by muscle, and that muscle itself is powered by sugar. There's no battery. There's, nothing other than essentially just sugar water, because that's what our muscle uses to generate power. So that was really cool. And then we showed a bunch of other things, like if we flash the light on it every day during like a certain period where it was like growing up or maturing, we call it differentiation, but essentially it's just growing up. The muscle got stronger. So like exercise made them stronger. So that was like, check, that makes sense. And also we tried doing things like cutting the muscle, like tearing it the way that you might do, like you're playing sports or you're doing something and you damage the muscle, you tear it in some way. We saw that we would learn different ways of sort of manipulating the muscle after damage, that it could heal and completely recover the force that it was producing after about 2 days. So this was really big because like, when we made a robot that moved and walked around, it was cool, right? But everyone's like, big whoop, like there are other robots that can move and they're faster than yours. So like, why does yours matter? And then we showed them like it matters because like my robot can come back from the dead, like can yours? And generally that is just not true. There's no synthetic actuator that you can break that's going to heal itself within 2 days and come back to its previous performance. So that was really big and really exciting. And since then, so I did my PhD at the University of Illinois, but I actually collaborated a lot with folks at Georgia Tech. So I would come to Atlanta like pretty much every year or every couple of years just to like meet people and talk about science. But I've been at MIT for about 3 years now. And a lot of what I've been focusing on is thinking about the muscle is cool, but something is controlling that muscle, right? Like our central nervous system in our brains and our peripheral nervous system that's coming out of our spinal cord and innervating our muscle and like sensing things like not just electricity and light, but it's sensing like pressure and pH and temperature. It's reacting to all this stuff processing it and then making some decision about whether that muscle should turn on or off. So my interests have kind of like gone a little more upstream, where I'm thinking about like what happens, like how are our neurons communicating with each other? How are they sensing signals in their environment? And can we engineer that in the lab so that we can make muscle that is controllable by more than just a flashing pulse of light, like is controlled by some sort of neural circuit. And that could be useful for robotics, right? You can make more complex biological robots, but it's also really useful just for understanding how to fix things when they're damaged. So like muscle is good at healing small tears, but if you have a big accident, lose a large chunk of your arm or your leg, like we've seen people with prosthetics and other things that they've never been able to recover that, and they have limited mobility and quality of life as a result. But if we could understand how to regenerate muscle better, or how to connect nerve to prosthetics or new muscle that we put in place, then we could help restore mobility for a lot of people. So that's kind of an overarching, I would say, description of my PhD and what I've been doing since then.
And so how has the coronavirus impacted your current job and your current day-to-day activities?
So much, so much. It's actually been a really, really tough year for me. From a kind of just like a day-to-day perspective, I'll start with that first. A lot of what I do, and it changes as you go along in science. When you're first starting off in science, a lot of what you're doing is like you're in lab, you're pipetting, you're machining things, you're 3D printing stuff, you're like wearing gloves and the white lab coat and the glasses and the whole thing. You're doing that. It's really fun. You complain about it when you're doing it, but as you get older and you get more removed from that, you're like, oh, I kind of miss those days. So like that was a lot of what I was doing in the beginning of my PhD, and it is a big part of what I do now as well. But because I've completed my PhD, I'm doing a postdoc and I'm looking at advancing further in my career, I also have a whole bunch of other responsibilities. So in addition to like doing science in the lab, I have to write grants to apply for research funding to do the kind of work that we're doing. I have to write papers. I have undergraduates, high school students, graduate students, technicians, younger postdocs, a lot of people that like I mentor and supervise. They're like, what do I do today? And I'm like, oh, right, I'm the person who tells you that now. So, the big part of my work that was completely decimated by the coronavirus was like just not being able to go into the lab at all. So you can't really make any progress on any experiments unless you're doing some sort of virtual computational simulation. You can't do anything. So like that was a big thing that changed. And right now, finally, as of like 2 days ago, MIT is back at full time. I can go into lab anytime I want and do the work as long as I log it and stay away from everybody and wear a mask, yada, yada. But it's been a long time coming, right? So like, that was the big day-to-day impact, but also there was a big impact in, like, I couldn't get papers published because I couldn't do the experiments for them. I was writing grants, but a lot of the funding organizations don't have money anymore to give to people because the economy crashed. So like, and then how do you mentor people when you don't see them and when they can't do anything, especially when a big part of what they were doing was going into lab 8 hours a day, right? Like, so all of that, on a day-to-day basis was very disrupted. And from like a career progression basis also, it was very hard for me. So I was on the faculty job market this past cycle. And what that means is essentially spent a year being like, somebody make me a professor. Like, this is what I would do if you gave me a bunch of money and a professorship title. Because I was like, I'm ready to start my own lab and like do all of these ideas that I have. But as you probably know from watching the news, like it wasn't a great time for people to be searching for jobs. Like me and a bunch of my friends, like we got job offers and then they were rescinded, or, like they weren't as good as we'd want them, or we didn't get the one that we were dreaming about, and like are trying to figure out what we should do instead and whether we should go on the market again this year. And it's just like, it was exhausting and hard and tiring. And that's the part that I'm still going through right now. And it's been a challenge. I think it's just been a challenge to like stay motivated. But I think that's true not only for scientists, but outside of science as well. One thing I will say is that I saw a really promising statistic, and I don't remember where it was from, and I don't remember the percentage, so it's not a useful statistic at all. But essentially, it was like the largest, like more people trust science and scientists now than they did before the pandemic, and they're like excited about the kinds of things that science can do to help the world and like combat things like the coronavirus. And my advisor, my boss, the professor that I work for, Bob Langer, he is the co-founder of Moderna, which is one of the companies that is like in the lead for developing the vaccine. So I feel like I see the value of doing good work better than I did before. Even though it's hard to do the work now, I know that when I'm allowed to go back in lab, like I'm going to do something that like might have impact on people's real lives. Like if they get sick, I may help them feel better. And people will value that and be happy and excited about what I do. So that part's been really encouraging. So not all bad.
And I think, like, I don't know what the statistic was, but just after that period where more people are starting to believe and no, science is real, I think that, if certain people who have the financial means to support some type of like scientific thing, that could also help scientists do their job.
Yeah, for sure.
And so I think that's a benefit as well.
Yeah, no, it's really cool. A lot of the work that I do, part of it is supported by government funds. So like we'll do things like MIT has an office in DC where you go and you advocate for Congress and like the budget being like, hey, like you should make sure to fund basic science research at the National Institutes of Health or the National Science Foundation. So a lot of that money comes from there, but also a lot of the money that we do comes from private foundations and philanthropic foundations. Like one of my most recent papers was partially funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And so that's the kind of thing where I think it's so important that you bring up money, because I think a lot of people don't think about the business side of science. Like science only gets done, like I could think of the most pie in the sky idea, but like if I wanted to buy this much of a protein to use in my experiments, it's like $10,000. It's so much money. So like every single thing that I need to do, every single plastic petri dish that I use in lab, somebody has to pay for it. And for them to pay for it, and, not only that, like MIT has to pay for the electricity and the labs and the fridge that I put the proteins in, right? Like it's a very expensive thing. So I have to convince a lot of people, not only that my idea is probably going to work, but that it's useful to other people and like useful to humanity and that they should fund it. So the business of science is a really big thing that you think about more and more as you advance in your career. So I think you're right that like the more people get excited about it and believe in the potential of it, the more likely they are to put their money into supporting science. And that's really important to us.
Absolutely. And so other than like trying to figure out financial means to support your project or, the coronavirus, all of these obstacles that you faced, have you seen or faced obstacles between an apparent gap of men and women in your field, or is it even?
Yeah, I definitely have. And it's funny because in biomedical engineering, there's a lot of variation between disciplines, right? So in mechanical engineering, for whatever reason, it's still predominantly men, maybe like 75%, 80% in a lot of undergraduate programs, and like more and more percentages as you go into like master's or PhD or anything above that. In biomedical engineering, people are always like, oh, like that's where all the girls go in engineering. They always say like, oh, it's 50-50 in undergrad. And that's certainly true. It wasn't a major that existed even when I was at Cornell. I was at Cornell 2008 to 2012. So I'm old, but not like terribly old. But like that wasn't even a major because it's such a new field. And ever since it started, there are so many girls that joined biomedical engineering that like the overall College of Engineering at Cornell is like 50-50 men and women right now. But a big part of it is because there are so many girls in biomedical engineering. And I have no idea why. Like people have this perception of something being more feminine or masculine. And I really think it's like the way we pitch things to young girls of like, if you show them as mechanical engineering as like trains and cars and you're like, girls aren't supposed to like those things, but then you show biomedical engineers as like helping people. They're like, oh, you should help people. But like all of those things help people. All of those things are exciting. There is nothing girly or not girly about anything. But for whatever reason, biomedical engineering 50-50. That's great. I also think part of it too is that like it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy where as soon as there are some women who are like advancing in the field, they're seen as role models. And so when you're looking at something to do as a young girl, you're like, well, I saw that girl doing that, so I'm going to do that. So as soon as there's some women in some field, you'll just start seeing more and more people being there because it's that important to people that they visualize a role model. So yes, 50-50 in biomedical engineering, but that's true at the undergraduate level. When I walk into a biomedical engineering lab, which is where I work in the largest biomedical engineering lab in the world. So on the one hand, it's not 50-50 because you're really pulling from a lot of different disciplines, right? You might have like a computer scientist or a physicist or an electrical engineer, but you also might have biologists and veterinary technicians who are like predominantly women. So you have all this mixes, but in the end, you might walk in, you might look at everybody and be like, that looks like there's a reasonable number of women here, or even 50-50 women. But something that I realized fairly early on in my time, especially at MIT, was even though there were a lot of women, I somehow at like age 25, which was when I started at MIT, was like the most senior woman there. Like I was the person that had the PhD, that was a postdoctoral fellow, that was working directly for Bob Langer, that like had the authority to like tell people what to do. Like a lot of the girls in the room were technicians or undergraduate students or high school students that were interning, and that was super, but like also kind of scary because you're like, one, how do I get more people to like keep going in this process and keep advancing? But also like puts a huge amount of pressure on you because a lot of people started looking to me at a very young age for advice and like expecting me to have all the answers. And also on days when like my experiments were going terribly, right? I'm like, I just want to quit. I don't want to do this job anymore. But I know that if I do, then like, that's it. I'm gone. And like, what are these 50 other girls going to do? Because they're going to look up and be like, oh no, she left. And maybe that's like undue pressure that I was putting on myself. And actually there was a professor that I really look up to. She's a woman who also works in my building at MIT. And she literally pulled me aside into her office one day. And she was just like, don't take all that pressure on yourself. Like it's hard. And like, sometimes if you want to quit or not do something, like you cannot feel that is all your fault that all these women are going to quit behind you. But whatever you can do to like succeed and promote other people is obviously helpful. I feel like I'm giving you very long-winded answers here, but overall, I would say that the trends are encouraging. There are more women. It just makes me feel more comfortable. I mean, it's just natural human instinct to like want to have more diverse looking people around you so you can like have things in common, not only with like how you look or how you dress, but also your interests or maybe where you're from or like the language you speak at home. More diverse teams make people feel more comfortable, and they also create more creative ideas. And I also I see how hard science is. And like, if you think about how far we've come in the past several hundred years, and that's predominantly like with rich, like white men doing the science, and like they've done great work, but imagine if we had extended that so like a lot of other people, then we would have had way more cool things and, you know, maybe more advanced cures, and maybe we would have gone farther in space. Like, we don't know, because we kept a lot of people out of science. So I think that's the biggest thing to me is I think about how can we get more people into science solving these problems, but also more importantly, once we get them in, how do we create a supportive community and an empowering community where they're being promoted and retained throughout that process? So that there aren't people like me just like holding down the fort, being like, somebody else join me because I can't fail. You know, I just want more of us here. And I think it's a really great job. So hopefully I can convince people to do it.
So the people who have come before you to not necessarily create the field that you work in, but just to gain more women into STEM in general. You had an opportunity to sit down with one woman who had been in STEM, you know, dead, alive, it doesn't matter. Who would it be?
Oh, it's a hard question. So the funny thing is that in terms of women that are alive, probably the women that I would pick are people that I've all met in the last year, which is like crazy to me. So I need to like revise my list. So for example, one of the people I met in the last year was Susan Hockfield. She was the first female president of MIT, and she wrote a book, which, oh no, I don't have a copy because I'll tell you why. So I went to a meeting by the Rosalind Franklin Society, where she was giving a talk on her book called The Convergence of Biology and Engineering. So like literally like what I do, like what research I have. And she's like this rock star essentially, right? 'Cause she's like the first female president at MIT and also the first like life scientist, like the first biologist to be president of this predominantly engineering and physics focused institute. So, you know, she gave this great, like I loved her book. She gave this great talk. And then I was supposed to give a talk after her on like the biological robots that I'd made. And I was kind of just like, oh no, like this is awkward and terrible. And I thought she would like leave, but she stayed. And then she told me that I gave a great talk. And she was like, aren't you in my building at MIT? Like you should come meet me sometime. So like we had a great sit down chat, talked about how things were changing. I asked her for advice on like how I should advance towards like faculty positions and making my own lab. And then I was like a total nerd and was like, would you autograph your book for me? Which I've never asked anyone. Like I'm not usually a super fangirl. Like if I saw somebody that was like a celebrity, I'm probably not going to go up to them and be like selfie. But when I saw her, I was like, yes, please, like do all the things. So yeah, she autographed it for my mom, saying, what was it? It was something really nice. It was like, congratulations on your amazing daughter or something. So I gave it to my mom and she like has it on our bookshelf right now. So she's really excited. So probably Living Woman with Susan Hockfield, and I got to meet her. That was great. But there are other, you know, and there are women that have like recently won the Nobel Prize and other things that I actually also met in the last year. Like I just happened to be invited to a conference where they were, and they got seated next to me at dinner, and I was just like, hello. And like we had conversations about science, but we also had conversations about hot sauce, you know? So like it was great to see them as people and great to see, and they're so nice. Like they are for the most part, like the opposite of uppity. Like they want me to be successful because they want more people like that to exist. So I think that was just like, it's just been a great experience for me, like how open and helpful people are. In terms of a woman who is not living right now, I mean, I kind of mentioned her. I told you that I met Susan Hockfield at the Rosalind Franklin Society meeting. And I think Rosalind Franklin, I mean, she's, you know, one of the big names, but the thing that really stands out to me about her work is that she did this really amazing, huge contribution to science, but a lot of her work was like stolen and people took credit for it. And that happened because she was a woman, right? And she didn't fully get credit for the kind of work that she deserved. And but now she's like this cult hero. We're all like, yeah, like justice for Rosalind. So, I mean, I would want to meet her, you know, just to like learn about what science and stuff was like at that time. But I think also just to like thank her and let her know that, you know, like, we got you. Like we know what you did. We appreciate it. And we're going to make sure that like what happened to you doesn't happen to other people in the future. So probably those two are my big heroes.
Everyone that I ask, they're always like, oh, they always get stumped because there's so many to choose from.
Yeah, no, it's so great. Actually, wait, can I mention one more? My biggest role model is my mom. I'm being cheesy, but like genuinely, like when I think about like women in science, like when people are like, oh, how come you didn't doubt yourself as like whether you could do science or whether you could be a good woman in science, it's like it was very obvious to me. One, because my mom's super smart and great at everything, right? Like everyone's like, my mom knows everything. So like I know that women can be great scientists because I saw it as like one of my very first memories. But the other really important thing is that my dad and my grandfather would always be like, she's so smart. Or like if they couldn't figure out something, they'd be like, hey, can you help me? And so I saw not only that she was smart, but that like men were recognizing her as an expert in her field and asking for a contribution. So it taught me what to look for in male allies and friends and supporters. So I think it was just like that life experience is something that I know not everybody has, but I hope people get to see or visualize in other aspects of their life because it can really change whether you believe in yourself or not.
Absolutely. I'll ask one more question. So if you had one piece of advice that you've been given or just one that you would want to give to girls looking to pursue biomedical engineering or a career in STEM in general, what would it be?
Yeah, I love being asked this question because I feel like I give this very like tough, no nonsense answer that people don't expect from me because I'm usually like pretty perky. Um, but I think that the worst advice that a lot of us get, especially in America, is the sense of like follow your dreams, like your ambition and like your creativity and your passion and like your dreams are so important, like follow your dreams. It's like what we hear all of the time, or at least that's what I heard, and maybe it's changing now. I think that's great. You should absolutely do something that you're interested in and excited about. But I think when you always think about it in terms of following your dream or following your passion, you're just thinking about like your own self-fulfillment as the goal of your life. And I don't think that that's a particularly great or impactful way to live. I think that the things that make me feel the best when I've done them is when I know that I had a positive impact on my community. Like I built something that could help somebody. I built something that created a new community. It doesn't have to be in science. It can be in any career. Do something that is useful to other people. One, because it'll mean that you had a positive impact on your society and your life had like a larger meaning. But two, because if you do something useful, then people are likely to pay you for it, right? Like I could have a passion for writing terrible poetry. And like, that doesn't mean, and you can still do that, but like, you can't expect that people can pay you for it. And I think for me as an immigrant, especially like somebody, I came to this country when I was fairly young, like didn't have much money, didn't know a lot of people. If I had just done whatever I wanted and didn't think about like, how am I going to provide for myself? How am I going to provide for my family? That would not have worked out well for me, right? So like when people say follow your passion, they're looking at it from this very privileged perspective of like, you'll probably be fine and you can keep living in your mansion home. And like people could do that. I mean, if you're a billionaire, by all means do that. But if you are a normal person, really think carefully, think strategically. You cannot start too young to think about like, what can I do that I enjoy, that people need, and that I will get paid for? And maybe that's like, I think sometimes people are like, that's too practical, but like, that's life. And like, the sooner you accept it, I think the better it will be for you.
Well, thank you so much for all of your wonderful advice and your contributions to science. So I am a senior, and I am currently applying. I applied to Georgia Tech, UGA, things like that. And right now I'm an intended chemical engineering major, but I'm also very impressionable right now. So having these types of talks, I think, is like swaying me in different directions of like, well, what do I want to do? And I think that you telling me about your work, it's like, well, that sounds really cool. Like I might want to do something like that.
Yeah. No, and that feeling never goes away. Like, I feel like I'll see people doing something else that's like in a different field. And like, what is this? And like I was saying, like the cool thing about like a career in science is that it teaches you how to learn about this stuff and apply it. So, you start off as a chemical engineer, and many of my close friends that I work with, my boss, actually, the co-founder of Moderna, who created the vaccine, is a chemical engineer. So like, you never know where your career is going to take you. So I think as long as you're like open to new experiences and just like excited to learn about new things, it'll be great. And Georgia Tech is an awesome program, so fingers crossed for you.
Yes, thank you so much. But yes, I'm going to read your book and look into all sorts of biomedical stuff probably right now. That's what I'm going to do with my Monday night. But thank you.
That sounds great. You're such a fun person. I actually mean that. And feel free to share like my contact information and social and stuff with your group. Like people message me all the time, and I try to do my best to respond.
Well, thank you so much. Like I had so much fun. Some people in science are not as personable or, like extroverted a little bit.
Yeah.
They're not sociable at all. I don't want to use the term robot, but something along those lines.
And I think that's like what you see on TV too, right? And then they're like, why don't people want to be scientists? I'm like, because you make them seem terrible. And you also make them seem like they know about geology and DNA and going to space and everything. I'm like, nobody is that smart. Most people know about like one thing, and then they have to work in teams and be sociable and talk to people. So like the best scientists I know are also some of the most like chatty, fun, like just easygoing people, including my boss. So that hopefully that encourages people too. It's not all like robots that don't go to parties.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you all for listening. If you have any questions or comments, you can contact us through Instagram, Twitter, Facebook at Colga Gems. You can also reach us through email. Our email is colgagems@gmail.com. That is COLGAGEMS. And I'll see y'all next time.